Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. So let me start with something that's, been bugging me, really. Why is it that when you look at the giants, America seems to be churning out these trillion-dollar companies, selling, AI, cloud stuff, even reusable rockets?
Yeah, the frontier tech.
Exactly. Whereas Europe's biggest players, they're often selling really sophisticated, but still, versions of 20th century inventions. Think turbines, chemicals, fancy jetliners. Is this gap just sort of how things are? Or is it pointing to something deeper, like a structural problem in Europe's economy?
That's the core question, isn't it?
We've been looking at this diagnosis, and it pins the blame somewhere quite surprising. Labor laws. Laws designed, almost 100 years ago?
That's the claim.
And the claim is pretty stark.
Yeah.
It's basically saying these 20th century rules are like a straitjacket, holding back 21st century innovation, especially the really risky breakthrough stuff.
And what's really interesting, I think, is looking beyond just the laws themselves. It's the sheer difference in how failure gets handled. That difference seems to massively shape how much risk companies are willing to take.
Failure. Okay.
Yeah, if you really want to get why one place disrupts and the other optimizes, you've got to unpack, what happens when things go wrong. Let's compare an American layoff versus a European one.
Okay, let's do that. The American model. Well, we all hear about it. It sounds pretty harsh, often gets criticized, but it's undeniably fast.
Speed is key there.
Right. You might have a manager getting a few hundred people on a Zoom call. There's a severance package, maybe a few months' wages, and boom, by lunchtime, your access card doesn't work.
It's clinical, almost.
It is. And the total cost, the estimates suggest, it works out to about 7 months of wages per employee. All in. But the crucial thing seems to be the speed and maybe even more, the certainty. Management knows their liability fast.
Exactly. Certainty is huge. Now, let's pivot to Europe. Think France, Germany, the big economies. If a large company there wants to do mass layoffs, maybe because a big project failed, well, it kicks off this whole mandatory, long, often quite political process.
Right. This is where the consultations come in, the works councils.
Precisely. Mandatory talks with powerful works councils, unions. Too often these folks are actually on the company's supervisory board, and they have to draw up this thing called a plan social.
A plan social. What does that actually involve? It sounds less like just firing people and more like a negotiation.
Oh, it absolutely is a negotiation. It's not just ticking boxes. It's a detailed social contract. It has to cover everything: better severance, retraining programs, sometimes even help with moving house for the workers.
Wow.
So a management decision suddenly becomes this big public debate. You get politicians involved, maybe strikes. And often the company doesn't even know the final cost or exactly how many people will go until a labor court rules on the whole plan. And that can take years.
Years? That delay must be incredibly costly in itself, beyond the actual payout.
It really is. And this is where you see that sticker shock. Remember the U.S. cost? About 7 months of wages.
Yeah.
Well, the data we've seen suggests in Germany, similar restructuring costs average out to about 31 months of wages per employee.
31, okay.
And in France, it jumps to 38 months.
38 months. That's over 3 years of salary for every person let go.
It's huge.
It almost sounds less like severance and more like a system designed to make managers terrified of hiring in the first place, or at least terrified of trying something risky that might fail.
That hits the nail on the head. The biggest cost isn't even just the payout money, staggering as it is. It's keeping people on the payroll who aren't, productive anymore because a project failed. It delays closing down those failures, delays reinvesting the capital elsewhere.
Or the opportunity cost.
Exactly. The uncertainty, the drag on capital reallocation, that's the real killer. It explains why you see big names like Bosch or Volkswagen announce job cuts now, but the actual restructuring timeline stretches out to, say, 2030.
Right.
They're bogged down while U.S. firms can often pivot much faster to the next thing.
Which brings us neatly to this argument from the venture capital world. The entrepreneurs trying to build high-growth companies, they talk about the economics of moonshots, right?
Yeah, the idea being that for truly disruptive innovation, you might need to fund, let's say, 10 really risky projects.
Okay.
And the expectation is that maybe 8 of those will fail spectacularly, leading to big, sudden job cuts.
That seems well built into the model then. Failure isn't a bug, it's a feature.
It's the essential math, particularly in tech. If the cost of dealing with those 8 failures is relatively low, like the U.S. model, then the whole approach works. Because the 2 successes, if one's the next Google or whatever,
it pays for everything else many times over.
Exactly. The risk is manageable because cleaning up the failures is quick and, relatively speaking, cheap.
But hang on, let's push back there a bit. That model assumes the only goal is maximizing shareholder value through rapid disruption. Isn't there an argument that forcing companies, like you said, Bosch, VW, to plan restructuring out to 2030 actually encourages more, measured, maybe sustainable innovation? It avoids the whole boom and bust, people losing jobs overnight thing we see in Silicon Valley sometimes.
That's a really important point about the social value, the stability argument. But when we're talking specifically about frontier innovation, things like AI, new battery chemistries, reusable rockets, the defining feature is massive uncertainty.
Right.
You can't really plan for those failures to happen nicely over 8 years. They tend to either work or not work, often quite quickly within a few quarters. So if sacking the team is incredibly expensive and takes forever,
then that high-risk, high-reward bet just looks too dangerous.
it fundamentally changes the calculus for management. The stress, the legal risk, the cost.
Yeah.
It often just doesn't seem worth it.
So it's maybe not that European bosses lack imagination. It's that the price tag for acting on that imagination is just exponentially higher.
I think that's a fair way to put it. Think about Apple. They tried for ages to build a self-driving car, right? It didn't pan out as hoped. So they fired 600 people relatively quickly last year, shut it down.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
That kind of decisive, maybe brutal, but decisive restructuring, that option, that cost structure, just isn't really available to many European firms in the same way. So it puts them off even entering some of these super high-risk fields, like, say, quantum computing or advanced biotech, because they feel they can't afford the 8 failures needed to find the 2 winners.
And you're saying there's actual economic data backing this up? It's not just anecdotes?
Oh, yeah. There's solid macroeconomic evidence. Research shows pretty clearly that tighter employment protection rules correlate with slower job churn.
Meaning people moving between jobs and companies.
Exactly. Less movement of talent and capital within industries. And that, in turn, correlates with weaker productivity gains compared to places where it's easier to reallocate resources, including people from failing ventures to promising new ones.
Okay.
If you can't move people quickly, it acts like a brake on the whole economy's dynamism.
Right. So the friction from these layoff rules, particularly in big countries like France and Germany, it's demonstrably real.
Yeah.
But, and here's where we need to be careful, I think, is it really the single reason for Europe's innovation gap? Is that framing maybe a bit too simple, ignoring other big factors?
That's the crucial next step, absolutely. The critique about labor friction hurting risky bets. It's valid, it's powerful, but you're spot on saying it's the only reason is an overreach. Europe's innovation issue looks much more like a systems problem.
A systems problem, okay.
Yeah, not just one law. Labor rules are definitely a deterrent for those moonshots.
Right.
But we have to look at least 3 other major bottlenecks that hold back growth, and these operate kind of independently of firing rules.
Okay, let's unpack those. What's bottleneck number 1 beyond labor laws?
Number 1 is scale and capital. Plain and simple. Europe's venture capital scene, the money available for growth stage companies, it's just shallower and way more fragmented than in the U.S.
Right, the infamous incomplete capital markets union we keep hearing about.
That's the one.
For someone listening, what does that actually mean practically for a founder trying to build something big in, say, Munich or Paris?
It means getting that first €1 million might be okay, but raising the really big money, the 100 million, the 500 million, the billion euros you need to truly scale up and compete globally, that's incredibly hard to do at home. The goal of the Capital Markets Union is basically to let, say, a German pension fund easily invest in a French AI startup, creating this huge single pool of European capital. But because it's fragmented...
The money doesn't flow easily across borders.
Right. So founders often have to go cap in hand to London or, more likely, the U.S. to get that essential scale-up funding.
So even if you made layoffs easier tomorrow, the sheer volume of growth capital isn't necessarily there within Europe to fund those potential giants. Okay, bottleneck number 2.
Number 2, energy costs. This has become huge, especially since 2022. Industrial electricity prices in Europe have been significantly and seemingly durably higher than in the U.S.
And that hits specific types of innovators harder.
Absolutely. Think data-heavy stuff. An AI company training massive models, a biotech firm running huge simulations. Their biggest operating cost often is just power.
Right.
That persistent cost gap compared to the U.S., it's a major incentive to locate those energy-hungry operations across the Atlantic.
That's a very real, almost physical constraint. Nothing to do with labor contracts in the 1930s.
Okay, and the third bottleneck,
Third is regulatory complexity, and this is broader than just labor rules. Imagine you invent a breakthrough medical device in, say, Ireland.
Yeah.
Getting it approved and licensed across dozens of different EU countries is a massive headache.
Yeah. Public procurement is fragmented. Product standards vary. An American company often deals with one main regulator, maybe state variations, but it's generally simpler to sell nationwide. A European company faces navigating 27 different systems to get true continental scale.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, we're looking at maybe 4 big levers: labor flexibility, capital availability, energy cost, and regulatory simplicity.
That's a good way to frame it.
And the argument is you can pull the labor lever all you want, but if the other 3 are still stuck, you won't get those trillion-dollar companies anyway.
Precisely. And it's worth remembering, labor rules aren't even uniformly strict across all of Europe. There's a really interesting counterexample. Denmark. They have this model called flexicurity.
Flexicurity. Okay, I like the name. Sounds like trying to blend flexibility and security. How does it work?
It's basically a whole societal deal. Denmark makes it relatively easy to hire and fire low formal job protection, so high flexibility.
So like the U.S. in that sense.
In terms of ease of dismissal, yes. But, and this is the crucial but, it's paired with incredibly generous unemployment benefits, sometimes lasting up to 2 years, and really strong government programs focused on retraining people quickly. Active labor market policies, they call them.
Ah, I see. So the company gets flexibility, but the worker gets a very strong safety net and help finding the next job.
That's the trade-off. The risk of losing your job is higher, but the consequence isn't catastrophic personally because the state steps in robustly in the result. Denmark actually has a pretty good innovation record for its size, high productivity.
Interesting.
It suggests the problem isn't necessarily Europe or even social safety nets themselves, but maybe the design of those systems in some of the larger economies, how they balance security with the need for economic dynamism.
Okay, so if flexicurity shows a possible path, it shifts the focus away from this sort of ideological battle over labor rights towards more kind of pragmatic system design.
Yeah.
How do you make restructuring, say, in France or Germany, less uncertain and painful without just ditching the social protections people value?
Well, based on the bottlenecks we identified, you'd want fixes that target those specific friction points. So first, on the labor side itself, predictability.
Make the cost known up front.
Exactly. Implement clearer, maybe time-limited rules for those mandatory consultations. Perhaps standardized calculation bands for the planned social payouts based on tenure or age. The goal is to reduce the massive legal uncertainty that makes CFOs so nervous. Even if the cost is still significant, knowing what it will be is half the battle.
Predictability over open-ended legal fights. Okay. What about capital?
You've got to push harder on that Capital Markets Union 2.0. That means things like a truly unified EU-wide system for listing companies on stock exchanges, finding ways to encourage pension funds to invest a bit more in growth companies' equities, and simplifying the paperwork, the prospectus rules, so raising that vital 100 million plus becomes easier within Europe.
Make the money flow. And finally, energy. That cost gap seems critical for future industries.
It really is. For AI, biotech, advanced computing, Europe needs to accelerate things like long-term renewable energy deals with power purchase agreements or PPAs and speed up grid connections for energy-intensive industries. If Europe can't offer competitive, clean power, those future industries will gravitate towards the U.S. or elsewhere.
Makes sense.
So yeah, looking at the evidence, labor rules are definitely one important lever, creating real friction. But Europe can't afford to fixate only on that. It needs to pull the capital markets lever, the energy lever, and the single market regulation lever just as hard if it really wants to boost innovation significantly.
We've spent a lot of time talking about the sort of economic cost of job security, how that social safety net might inadvertently stifle really high-risk innovation.
Yeah.
But maybe let's end on a different thought. What about the hidden value of that security? You mentioned Denmark's flexicurity, which suggests you can combine dynamism and safety nets.
Right, it's not necessarily either.
So, does that underlying stability, that social cohesion that comes from knowing there's a net, does that offer a kind of long-term resilience that maybe America, with its sometimes harsher economic cycles and volatility, might actually envy when the next big global crisis hits?
That's a really profound question to ponder.
Something to think about anyway, next time you see those quarterly earnings reports roll in. Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.